Imagine you were processed as Charity, your name misspelled, your belongings inventoried into a tin, and your body listed in a ledger that could erase you with one stroke. On the night the East River went moonless and the ferry horn sounded twice, a laundry clerk slipped into the superintendent's office with a decoy keyring and a bundle of ferry chits. She turned the hospital's own books against it, marking the living as removed and the dead as claimed. She opened a rusted lock that should have stayed sealed, and a cart meant for cadavers rolled the wrong way. But when the pier lantern failed and the last boat delayed for sleet, the trap she set began to close on her instead. Would the paper trail hold when the river would not? Before we dive in, subscribe if you value original investigations. New cases every week. The discovery began far from the island. On March 12, 2023, at the Municipal Archives on Chambers Street, an archivist opened a gray Hollinger box labeled Charity Hospital. Disposition Book, 1899 to 1903. Between sheets of onion skin carbon, a charged image surfaced, a thin bundle of ferry chits pinned to a page where the daybook listed 2 unclaimed women, but the chits counted 3 crossings that night. Ink had bled in a ladder pattern, as if moisture rose through the paper at some past awakening. The archivist photographed the page, the pinholes, and the watermark of a medical school on a faint receipt pasted beneath. The image would become the first door. At the turn of the century, Blackwell's Island held a closed grammar of care and disposal. Ferries ran at dawn, and at the 9th hour, their horns drifting across the East River like warnings. The chapel bell kept island time, the same stroke-setting meal trays, ward linen, and the morgue's ice. Admission began with a name, a language, a locket, or buttoned purse placed into a tin, and a ward assignment. From there it was routines, bed checks, ledger entries, assigned shifts. The island offered shelter from the city and also anonymity. Under Charity, people became entries, and entries could be moved. Zofia Ryback entered this grammar the way steam enters a room, quiet, persistent, hard to see until it condenses on glass. She worked at the women's laundry, a low building near the waterline that breathed all day, its windows clouding and clearing with the rhythm of ringers. She had once copied grocery sums for a street grocer on the Lower East Side, learning to lay columns straight and catch the slip of a 6 into an 8. At the laundry, she kept 2 ledgers in her head, the hospital's daybooks, and a private register of anomalies. She noticed when the morgue daybook recorded unclaimed, while a ward book recorded sister visited. She noticed when a phenol bottle disappeared from the disinfectant shelf and returned with a ring of dried stain. She noticed because she could not stop counting. Each dusk, she took her break where the breeze could strike her lie-burned lungs and listened for ferry horns, marking 1 for arrivals, 1 for departures, and the unsounded third only in her mind. Her wound had a shape. In late autumn of 1900, her younger sister Aniela had been admitted with fever. Zofia had carried a shawl and a little bag of coppers to the admission ward, watched a clerk spell Ryback, then Ryback, then cross the K to a T and leave it. She was told to return on the 9th hour visiting day. By the time it came, the morgue shed had already pulled the sheet. Aniela Rebit appeared in the daybook as unclaimed, though Zofia had left her shawl with a sewn name strip. The coroner's aide, a man who smelled of carbolic and cheap rye, signed the form with a slur of letters. The island processed her grief as a disposal. The hospital system thrived on small coercions. Dr. Bellamy liked his sums and donors. To them, he displayed neat tables of charity rendered and bodies decently buried at the charity burial ground. He walked with a silver watch he set by the chapel bell, the chain heavy as an oath. Matron Pike enforced the women's wards with ration cards and strict lines. A patient who talked too much about leaving found herself in isolation, her visits postponed past health. Silas Rourke visited by night, always at blue hour, a ledger under his arm that balanced dollars against specimens. He used the ferry pier like a theodolite, aligning his nights to the 2 horns. Thomas Delaney arrived when he was needed, and when he was not, stamping unclaimed onto forms as if the word belonged to him. Zofia's competence began to tilt the room. She traced the traffic of paper and bodies. The morgue daybook was the master, a bound volume with thick leaves that felt like responsibility. She did not have the key, but she had eyes and time. She saw pages where past entries had been lifted and relaid, the corners now pebbled from damp. She counted how many ferry chits came each night. The ferry clerk tore them from a roll and skewered them on a string, a child sometimes sliding the string over an arm like a bracelet. On nights when the daybook listed one unclaimed, the chits sometimes came in threes. She tallied Matron Pike's rounds against lantern times. She noticed a rusted lock on the body lift that squealed at the wrong hours. She found a dried ring on a phenol bottle matching nights when the anatomy theater across the river scheduled its morning dissections. An unexpected witness crossed her path, a small boy with a cap too large, waiting at the ferry pier, playing with a string of used ticket stubs. He made no sound Zofia could use, yet his stubs counted a number that did not fit the night. She wrote that number in soap on the inside of a window, then scrubbed it away so the pain would clear, and carried the count in her lungs. In January of 1901, sleet began to change the island's sounds. Ringers dragged. Skate marks appeared on the path between women's laundry and morgue shed, where orderlies slid on purpose to move faster. The superintendent's office kept later hours. From the laundry, Zofia could see the rectangle of lamplight stay until the 9th hour bell. She knew her own limitations. Steam made her cough until her ribs ached, but the work of watching demanded only patience. She seated her own artifacts as anchors. In the laundry's back corner, she hung a decoy keyring fashioned from discarded blanks and a snapped loop, polishing them with ash so they would look handled. She set aside a folded packet where she copied, from memory, dates when Aniela's name should have kept her from being unclaimed. She recovered a discarded ferry chit from the floor near the clerk station and pressed it between the pages of a little devotional, hiding the chit's iron staple under the spine. She put a nick in the rusted lock, a scratch that would give later investigators something to align to a date. Her private ritual sharpened into a plan the night she observed Silas Rourke arrive early, before blue hour, his ledger strapped with twine. He crossed to the superintendent's office, stayed 2 bell strikes, then returned to the pier just as the sleet turned from rain to needles. Zofia saw how the island's physics could be turned. If the ferries kept time and the ledgers kept the ferries, then breaking the time could break the sums. She did not need to torch a building or brew a poison. She needed to make a book tell its own lie in public. The first trial came on a Sunday when most visitors were kept on the city side by weather. Zofia timed her laundry run to bring her past the admission ward on the way to the incinerator. She carried a basket that hid a tin of lye, and beneath it, a wrap of onion skin paper taken from the supply shelf. In the empty hall, where the lamp hissed low, she copied 2 names from the posted ward card into the exact script used in the morgue daybook, then slid the onion skin behind a loose paste down at the back of the volume where pages had been lifted before. Her hand shook once. She breathed through the acid of lye and steadied. The names would not free anyone. They would force the daybook to contradict itself when the ferry chits in the coroner's forms came due. The second trial exploited Matron Pike's habit. At the 9th hour, the matron checked the laundry tally board for sheets and gowns, leaving her keyring on a nail. Zofia hung her decoy keyring on a second nail, 1 step to the left. Matron Pike returned, reached without looking, and took the wrong ring. Zofia's ring included a morgue key, blank scraped until it would catch and then slide, a useless shape promising authority. It bought Zofia minutes in a corridor, clear of supervision. She did not enter the morgue then. She only checked how the island's locks responded to stress and how long it took for Pike to realize the weight in her pocket felt wrong. It took 1 bell stroke and a cough. The third seed concerned the ferry. Zofia befriended the habit of the clerk, not the man. The clerk always skewered the night's chits into a bundle and pinned it there, just under the ferry schedule in the superintendent's office. The bundle's pin opened and closed the same hole each night. Zofia noted the fray of the paper, how the hole had widened to a little tear. She knew that if the bundle went missing on a night when the daybook said 2 unclaimed, the superintendent would write to the ferry to ask for a count. A request would make a copy. Copies multiplied the chances of inconsistency. By mid-February, the island heard the same names repeated along the corridors, the nurses saying them in lists, Zofia writing them in soap, the bell marking time that no one could return. The weather shifted to sleet and back, the wind sheer at the ferry pier making lanterns stutter. The superintendent's office sealed a packet with his signet, the wax dark like dried phenol. Silas Roark used the same night messenger twice. Zofia recognized his boots from the slush pattern. Thomas Delaney stamped unclaimed twice in a row on the same date for different entries, his hand leaving a little notch of ink. In the municipal archives, the archivist's photograph of the bundle of chits, the pinholes, and the pasted medical receipt cast a long shadow forward. The image would later let an investigator align the night of sleet to the ferry's own payroll, which paid the hornmen by crossing. But on the island, the only clock that counted was the bell. The plan required one more element, misdirection at the moment of inspection. Zofia knew that at the 9th hour on the last Monday of each month, Dr. Bellamy audited the morgue daybook against the admission ward tallies. He set his watch by the chapel bell before he began and placed it beside the ledger to measure himself against himself. He believed in the bell. On the morning the sleet returned with teeth, the lanterns at the ferry pier burned low. Zofia wrapped her scarf high to spare her lungs, stowed the decoy keyring inside the laundry basket, and counted the horn blasts, 1 for arrival, 1 for departure. She waited for the third that never sounded, the one she kept in her chest for nights when time itself needed to change. The 9th hour bell lifted its hammer. The 9th hour bell swung through sleet, each strike blunted by the river's breath. Zofia had measured toward this hour for weeks, not with grand devices but with small frictions. Paper against pin, a key that almost fit, a count that refused to equal itself. Her method would not ignite the island, it would tilt its balances and let gravity do the rest. She set her first piece in the women's laundry where steam hid intentions. The tally slate showed sheets short by 2 bundles, a variance Matron Pike always chased with a walk to the storehouse. Zofia chalked the variance and hung the decoy keyring where Pike's glove would find it. When the matron took the loop and strode away, her steps made the corridor boards click. 1, 2, 3. Zofia waited for the 4th, the point where Pike passed beyond the laundry doorway and the sight line to the superintendent's office opened. The office lamp burned as expected. The morgue daybook lay square on the desk, a metal weight holding its leaves. She crossed the yard under the rattle of sleet. The path's cinders had gone soft, shoe prints kept their edges. At the office threshold she wiped her soles on the choir mat, not to hide entry, but to leave an unmistakable ordinary trace. On the desk, she lifted the paperweight and aired the daybook just enough to release a smell of carbolic and damp leather. She did not need to alter what lay written. She needed to move what should not move. Her second piece made use of the bundle of ferry chits. The chits for that day were already threaded and pinned below the ferry schedule, their iron staples shining with faint rust. Zofia unfastened the pin and pressed the bundle under the daybook's backboard, along the spine where paste had loosened from prior tampering. She left 1 chit, only one, on the pin, an orphan square that, when Bellamy returned, would accuse the clerk or the ferry as much as it accused the book. The move gave the ledger a pocket watch's secret compartment. It also linked the night's count to Bellamy's own custody. Outside, the ferry pier lantern flared and sank as sleet found the wick. The river was a shoulder turning away. The third piece required the morgue shed. Zofia carried a laundry cart as cover, its wooden wheels chattering on the path. Inside the shed, under slabs and the iron pulley, the rusted lock on the body lift hung like a warning. Her decoy keyring had no authority here, but it had a silhouette. She let the largest blank sink into the keyway and twist until it caught and then slipped, producing the sound of a key turning without the function. She used her left hand to steady the bar and her right to push with a cloth so her skin would leave no oil. The lock gave, not to the key but to the habit of being forced. The lift stuttered and then settled at floor level. She rolled the empty beer onto it and left its wheels set in a splayed V that later would be recognizable in photographs. She placed the phenol bottle on the lift's corner, its dried ring matching entries in the daybook's margins when Anatomy Theater receipts appeared. The object would argue for her, but only if someone connected times across water. Set piece 1 belonged to the superintendent's office. At the 9th hour, Bellamy always aligned his watch in the daybook, then paced the columns with a finger. Zofia had left him 2 contradictions. He would find the pinned chit missing, assume an error, and open the daybook to search for it. When his eyes tracked the inner board, he would feel the thickness and lift the back to shake free the hidden bundle. That act, not hers, his, would fix his possession of evidence he could not explain. She never planned to be in the room for the moment. Her aim was to make the room speak by itself. Set piece 2 fell to the storehouse and Matron Pike. With the decoy keys, Pike reached the storeroom and discovered that the ring in her glove did not open its lock. Habit made her retrace. On that return, Zofia needed Pike to collide with a second confusion. Zofia crossed back to the laundry and hung the true ring where Pike had left the false. The matron reclaimed it without thought, found the storehouse openable, and cursed paperwork rather than people. In her delay, an orderly on corpse detail would arrive at the morgue shed without supervision, exactly as Zofia intended. Set piece 3 required the ferry pier and the night cart. Zofia steered the empty bier from the morgue shed toward the pier, not along the open path where sleet made skating easy, but through the yard behind the admission ward, a route used for trash. She kept the cart's wheels in the thin track of the ash wagon so that later a handler might question the marks and follow them. At the pier, she angled the bier against the lee of the shack so that the next arrival would find a cart out of place, its handles pointing toward the water instead of the morgue. The wrong orientation would translate as intent in any report. While she worked the cart, the unexpected witness stepped into the seam of her plan. The fairy child with the string of used stubs waited under the pier roof, the cap brim low. He toyed with the stubs, running them along the rail and counting in silence. Zofia did not need him to speak. She needed him to keep counting. He would later show an investigator, by gesture alone, how many crossings the horns had truly marked that night, his string thick where the daybook said thin. Set piece 4 belonged to the morgue shed again, and to Thomas Delaney, the coroner's aide. Delaney had a rhythm, stamp, tag, sign, and then a swallow of rye hidden in his coat. Zofia had noted that on nights when sleet thickened, he stamped hastily and duplicated dates. She placed herself along the corridor near the admission ward notice board, a sheet bundle in her arms, and timed her passage to let him overtake. His footprints printed sharply in the slush, wide instep, worn heel on the right. She would need those prints when the path's traffic needed reconstructing. The island's geometry turned around small mistakes. Delaney made them as if he believed paper forgave. The countermove arrived as forecast and yet wrong. The ferry pier lantern puffed once and then failed, a drop of water hissing where it had no business. The horn called once more for a boat that did not dock. Word ran by posture and speed. The last ferry would delay for sleet, the ropes too stiff to catch and the city side reporting ice. Zofia's misdirection depended on the regularity of crossings. A delay would snap lines in ways she could not predict. The island would hold its people and its paperwork like a fist. She adapted the only way her method allowed, by letting objects insist. She returned to the superintendent's office and slid the office window's latch with the side of her hand, leaving a smudge of lie that the later archivist's camera would interpret as a thumb-free print. She nudged the daybook a finger's breadth off square, so that when Bellamy returned he would reform it, a reflex captured by the depression of the paperweight on damp leather. She placed the lone ferry chit she had left on the pin under the weight, where it could not be ignored by even a distracted hand. The office clock ticked out of rhythm with the chapel bell. In that dissonance, she heard her chance narrow. At the women's laundry, she organized her lookouts without words. An elder worker took a position by the stove door with a long wooden paddle, a posture that signaled whether the Matron Pike corridor was clear. A young ward helper ferried folded sheets past the admission ward and would pause if Delaney lingered too long in the hall. The laundry's own hum covered any misstep. The ringers sang without tuning. Zofia used the lull to plant the last breadcrumb. She scratched a second shorter mark under the first on the rusted lock at the morgue shed, this one fresh and bright under sleet. 2 marks, 2 times. When someone tried to claim the lock had not been opened, the metal would say otherwise. The island's choreography stuttered. Silas Rourke arrived earlier than usual, the blue hour not yet set, his ledger tied with the same twine. He disliked wasted crossings. The delay made him visible. He stood at the ferry pier with impatience that showed in the way his boot toes cut the slush in straight lines. He needed the cart and the classification. Without a crossing, his receipts thinned. He moved toward the superintendent's office and found the door unlatched. Zofia watched from the laundry shadows as lamplight spilled and a silhouette bent over the desk. She could not see the eyes, but she could read body language when the hand lifted the daybook, felt a thickness at the backboard, and shook free the bundle of fairy chits. The paper rasp sounded like a saw through bone. He tucked the bundle under his coat. Ownership transferred in an instant. This theft, if it was theft, expanded her plan and also tightened the trap. She had meant for Bellamy to discover the hidden chits and choke on the contradiction. Instead, Rourke pocketed the proof in a panic. The island would now show not only contradictory counts, but a missing bundle, last seen in the superintendent's custody and then in the orbit of a broker. Zofia recalculated. Misdirection could still hold if she could fix a second contradiction in the morgue shed. She returned to the lift, eased the beer off the platform, and deliberately rolled the cart toward the ferry pier again, aligning its tracks alongside the ash wagon's path until the two sets of wheels diverged near the pier's plank edge. She then pushed the empty cart into the ferry office vestibule, a place where it never belonged. This was the shocking act her plan had always promised. A cart meant for cadavers rolled the wrong way, a vocabulary error in wood and iron. If a night porter found it, the question would write itself in the morning report. Why was the morgue's cart waiting for a boat that did not come? The sleet thickened to needles. Matron Pike, now with her true keys, rattled doors with restored confidence. Dr. Bellamy returned to his office and found the window unlatched, the daybook slightly skewed, and the single-pinned chit pressed under the paper weight. Instinct made him align the book and check the pin. The absence of the bundle was a presence. Outside, Silas Rourke waited with a coat that bulged at the breast, the geometry of a packet under fabric. Thomas Delaney drifted corridor to corridor, stamping and sipping, leaving duplicate dates like bread dropped on a dark path. Zofia took her place beside the laundry stove and counted breaths to keep her lungs from seizing. Her lookouts shifted. The elder stood with the paddle angled low, meaning Pike had turned toward the admission ward. The young helper set a stack down with corners askew, meaning Delaney had paused by the morgue, not the pier. The fairy child threaded his string of stubs through his fingers and watched the hornless river. She had wanted the island to confess by its own reflexes. The delay forced her to become a witness to her own arrangement. The superintendent's office would now record a letter to the ferry asking for counts. The ferry clerk would reply with a payroll tallied by crossings. The daybook would show names Zofia had traced on onion skin reappearing where they did not fit. The phenol bottle placed at the lift corner would match the stain ring dates to dissection mornings upriver. The rusted lock bore 2 scratches like minute hands at different angles of the same hour. She knew also what the delay meant for her body. She could not leave the island on any excuse. The sleet had closed the door she might have used to reduce suspicion. She would be on shift when the contradictions broke in the morning, and when the morning made its calls, office, morgue, pier, her name would be one of the names present. Point of no return formed not as a bang, but as a locking of sequences. The cart stood in the wrong vestibule. The chits lay under the coat of a man who should never touch them. The superintendent's desk bore the square left by a paper weight and the absence it had covered. The bell would strike the 10th hour in a while. Between now and then, nothing could be undone without making a louder sound. Zofia folded her damp cuffs, set her tally slate for the next sheet count, and fixed her eyes on the chapel bell through the laundry's fogged window. When it moved again, the island would move with it, and she with the island. The plan had crossed its own river. Pre-dawn, the sleet relented to a fine grit that made the island look dusted rather than drowned. A pier porter opened the ferry office vestibule and stopped at the wrong geometry of wood and iron. The morgue cart waded nose to the river, its handles turned from the morgue shed, as if a decision had reversed during the night. The porter's notebook recorded a simple line, cart mislaid, sleet, yet the wheels left a sharper account. The splayed V stance Zofia had arranged at the lift repeated here in faint twin arcs, then diverged where the ash wagon's track split near the planks. The cart's metal corners carried a dusting of salt blown from the water rather than chalk from the slab room, placing it at the pier during the delay. He followed the parallel marks back toward the shed and saw how footfalls complicated the path. Thomas Delaney's wide instep printed in the thaw, the right heel cupped where the leather had thinned. A thinner tread, Zofia's, kept to the cinder verge, then disappeared in a zone of slid prints where workers had skated sheet bundles through the night. The rusted lock on the lift bore 2 scratches bright as new metal, misaligned like minute hands at different minute marks, proof it had been worked at least twice. The phenol bottle still sat on the lift corner, chalked by a dried ring that matched dates earlier in the morgue daybook when receipts from the anatomy theater upriver appeared. At the 9th hour, Dr. Horace Bellamy unlocked the superintendent's office and found precisely what Zofia had intended him to find and more. The office window latch wore a smear of lye rather than oil. The daybook lay a shade off true under its paper weight, as if the previous reader's hand had replaced it in a hurry. On the pin beneath the ferry schedule, only one ferry chit remained, pressed under the weight like a pinned insect. Bellamy reached, aligned, and felt the absence before his eyes admitted it. The bundle of ferry chits for the prior crossings could not be accounted for in his custody. He opened the daybook and turned the later leaves. At the paste down, loosened years before and recently again, nothing bulged. The space where the bundle had been tucked no longer held its thickness. Paper and cloth told the same story differently. Something had been hidden, then taken. The island's reflexes engaged. Bellamy drafted a letter to the ferry superintendent requesting the crossing counts for the delayed night. He dated it March 1st, 1901, and sealed it with dark wax. He sent a runner to the morgue shed to check inventories. He paged Matron Agnes Pike to verify linen tallies and Thomas Delaney to reconcile forms stamped unclaimed with ward books listing visitors. In the few minutes it took for the summons to spread, Silas Rourke walked from the pier to the office with a coat breast that bulged unnaturally. The sleet had salted the twine he used to strap his ledger, leaving light flecks that marked the fibers like stars. He stood at the office door and asked to wait inside, a posture that admitted familiarity without words. He took a chair. Moisture bled from his hem onto the choir mat in a rectangle that would later be photographed against the woven pattern. The ferry answered by noon. The hornmen had been paid for 2 attempted approaches and no final docking. The payroll clerk enclosed a chit count that, by rote, the office pinned to its schedule. The packet also contained a note of used stubs recovered from a child on duty, returned by custom rather than rule. The string of stubs was thicker than the morgue daybook's tally of one unclaimed would allow. The ferry child, summoned and made to stand under the lintel, ran the stubs through his fingers until a clerk took the string and hung it from a nail, where its weight did the declaration no voice needed to do. By afternoon, the contradiction stood in 3 places. The ferry office had a cart that did not belong, and stubs that outnumbered the book. The morgue shed had a lift that had been worked after hours, and a phenol bottle that argued for anatomical transfer. The superintendent's office had a missing bundle of chits last known to have been pinned in his view. Matron Pike brought the linen slate and set it down with a firmness that said she wanted this to be about sheets. It would not be. Thomas Delaney arrived with a breath that added rye to carbolic and unfolded forms that bore the same date twice in 2 different inks. The first institutional body to touch the case was the Board of Charities, alerted by Bellamy's telegram sent just after noon. The board dispatched an inspector and a stenographer to the island on the first boat that could risk the upriver ice that day, the crossing made at the 4th bell. They met in the superintendent's office, a narrow room that had become the case's theater. The inspector turned pages while the stenographer indexed the morgue daybook against the admission ward lists. Zofia, called by Pike to supply laundry records, stood where the women's laundry steam could no longer hide her lungs and placed her stack of slates on the edge of the desk. She said nothing because nothing was asked of her, yet her presence weightened the ledgers she had arranged to speak. The inspector's method was simple and devastating. He placed the single-pinned ferry chit on the blotter, and beside it, the string of stubs. He wrote the number each represented in words in his own hand, 1 against 3. He lifted the daybook and measured its backboard against the desk's edge, then ran his nail along the loosened paste. He inspected the rusted lock and the twin scratches, noting their brightness relative to the surrounding oxidation. He placed the phenol bottle ring against dates when the anatomy theater's receipts appeared. Each object required the others to matter. Together, they made a chain that crossed rooms and the river. When Silas Rourke rose to leave, The coat breast's bulge knocked against the desk. The twine's salted flecks left a dusting on the dark wood. The inspector's eye moved, not to Rourke's face, but to the outline of a packet where thick paper met fabric. Rourke understood what the look meant and tried to recast his exit as an errand to the pier. The stenographer set down her pencil and stood. Rourke hesitated one breath too long, then turned. In that small arc, the twine slid, and the bundle of fairy chits fell to the coir mat with a sound dry as tinder. Paper splayed, revealing hospital pinholes that matched the schedule board's tear. Ownership came unstitched. By the next morning, March 2nd, 1901, the coroner's office opened an inquest in a whitewashed room off the admission ward corridor, seated on chairs borrowed from the chapel. The ferry clerk testified in numbers. The board inspector read counts into minutes that would be copied at the municipal archives a century later. Dr. Bellamy presented his watch by reflex and then, remembering, put it away. Matron Pike described linen without being asked, the edge of her ration cards creasing the table. Thomas Delaney admitted duplicate stamping under weather conditions. Silas Rourke attempted to translate the bundle of fairy chits as a reconciliation errand run on the hospital's behalf. The inspector did not accuse. He placed the chits, the daybook, and the string on a table and wrote the word inconsistent in a line that touched all three. The coroner reserved his sharpest term for the act at the pier. The phrase improper conveyance entered the record to denote a morgue cart positioned for river transfer without authorization. That phrase would, within a year, harden into statute. Papers in the city took the case by the afternoon edition. They used the island's former name and the modern one interchangeably, writing of Blackwell's and Charity with equal appetite. Headlines promised a scandal of bodies sold, and the copy under them found the smaller, truer shape, a charity machine that turned people into entries and entries into inventory. Reporters described the bell that set trays and lifts. They quoted numbers from the board and counted fairy horns as if the sound could be printed. Outcomes detached from secrets and attached to rooms. Dr. Horace Bellamy resigned under the board's recommendation. His silver watch entered into evidence to fix the time he had claimed as alibi against the bell's own count. He left the island on the 5th, his chain lighter than it had seemed. Matron Agnes Pike retained her post, but lost discretion. Ration cards went to a central office, rounds were timed by 2 rather than 1, and isolation decisions required signatures in duplicate. Thomas Delaney was indicted for falsification of forms and suspended. His stamp, once heavy on paper, sat in a drawer with twine on it for provenance. Silas Rourke faced charges for trafficking in unclaimed dead and for theft of the hospital's papers. The ledger he had strapped with salted twine offered its own receipts to the city prosecutor when its pages were read. Zofia Ryback was not named in the public record. Her shelter was the system's own blindness to the labor that moves it. The board's inspector noted laundry staff present in the room where contradictions were weighed and later recorded the laundry's slate totals as corroboration for the ward counts. Quietly, in early spring, her forewoman arranged a transfer to the admission ward clerks, a desk piece that kept her out of constant steam. The cough did not leave. She kept her ritual in a modest form. At dusk, she still counted ferries, 1 for arrival, 1 for departure, and held a 3rd for the days the river refused the island. The policy backlash, the echo, took the longest and lasted the longest. In late winter of 1902, the state amended its unclaimed body statute. Disposition now required 2 independent attestations copied into separate books. Ferry counts needed reconciliation with hospital daybooks each week, signed and countersigned, and the city opened a registry posted every 7th day outside the admission ward, listing the unclaimed by name and ward so that a sister crossing on the wrong morning might still find a line that refused to erase her. Medical schools were obligated to attach provenance slips to receipts, naming institutions and dates that could be read back against ferries and bells. The phrase improper conveyance, born from that cart found nose to the river, became a defined offense. The municipal archives kept the paper. A century later, the gray Hollinger box would admit a photograph of a bundle of chits pinned where they should not be, and a faint watermark from a school that had trusted the island's sums. The archivist who took that image also recorded the scratches on the rusted lock, the indentation of a paper weight on damp leather, and the ring on a phenol bottle dried to a ghost of chemical rain. In those residues, the night retold itself without a voice. Life on the island changed in small and telling ways. The ferry office kept its lantern mantles in doubles. The superintendent's office window latches were checked by 2 clerks at close each evening. The morgue shed replaced the lift lock and filed the old one with its twin scratches into a drawer labeled spent. Workers at the women's laundry found their tally slate now initialed by any matron before numbers could travel. On certain nights, a small figure still stood under the pier roof with a string of stubs, counting crossings until a clerk lifted the string and hung it on the nail that had widened to a tear. The final image returns to the bell that started each morning. On a gray day in spring, Zofia stood outside the admission ward with a list she had typed from the posted registry, reading the names softly in her head. The chapel bell struck once, then once again, the measure familiar. She waited for a third that did not sound and did not need to. In the ledger open on her desk, names no longer ended in unclaimed without contest. Beside the column, a narrow margin carried a second hand, written in words from a ferry across the river. The bell's tone had not changed, but its work had.